Hello everybody, I'm Chris. I'd like to welcome you all back to the next installment of this series that I'm doing on how to analyze literature. In the previous installment of this series, I did a sample analysis, sort of a model of how to analyze a short story, and the story that I was focused on was the Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. So we did a breakdown of how to examine character and conflict in that story, protagonist, antagonist, and how the conflict is developed and the plot is developed in that story. So in this particular installment, I'd like to spend a little time talking about the main character being the protagonist, of course, and talking about character motivation and character influence, because these two terms are very important to understand and to apply in stories. And any kind of solid analysis will deal with these two terms in one way or another. So I put them side by side on the board so that people could see they are two distinctly different terms, and yet they are very closely connected, as we will see. So let's begin with discussion of character motivation, because this gets into a whole very important side to the story. All right? What drives a character to do something in a story? So motivation, or motive, can be defined as something that causes a person to act in a certain way, or, if you want to use a synonym, the word incentive. All right, so I took this dictionary definition from the website dictionary.com, which I think is a valuable resource. So what are some factors that can motivate characters and have a strong driving force on characters? So, for example, is a character motivated by greed? Character can be motivated by anger. Characters can be motivated by hatred. On the other side, characters can be motivated by love, or jealousy, or even desire. So, these could all have a strong pull on a character. Any one of these or any combination of these. And of course, you could add onto the list as much as you want, but I think that these ones on the board here are very commonly represented in stories of various kinds. So, when I use the word desire, I'm not just talking about physical desire in the way that you would think about physical attraction for another person in a story, although that, of course, is common in literature as well. But I'm talking a little bit broader definition of the word desire. So I really connect the word desire to the word want. So I said in previous installments that characters, and particularly main characters or protagonists, they want something. Okay? They have a goal, they have an objective, they have a purpose. They set something for themselves to achieve, some mission. I used the word mission before. So, looking at what the word want entails, what specifically do they want? Well, to break it down into smaller categories, protagonists or main characters want what? Well, they may want to do something. As I said, a goal, a purpose. They may want to go somewhere. They may want to get something. Or they may want to have something. Or they may want to find something. So, just briefly, let me touch upon some examples of stories that fall into these categories. So, starting with the one we looked at in the last installment of this series, the Cask of Amontillado. What does Montresor, the protagonist, want? Well, he wants to do something. All right? He wants to do something. What is it that he wants to do? He wants to kill Fortunato. So, we look at that and then we think about, why does he want to kill Fortunato? What is his motivating factor? What is driving him to kill Fortunato? Well, obviously in that story, we can talk about hatred. His hatred for Fortunato is so great. His hatred for Fortunato is so strong that he cannot tolerate Fortunato's existence anymore. And when we talked about this whole thing about how Fortunato insulted him, this drives Fortunato's insult, drives Montresor to seek revenge. And his revenge is in the murder of Fortunato. All right, so that's a definite motivating factor right there, hatred, in that story. In a story that we looked at and talked about, the play by Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, of course, what is Romeo's motivation? Love for Juliet. Okay? And in fact, Romeo and Juliet has been described as the greatest love story ever told. So obviously Romeo is an iconic figure of this representation of romantic love. So his motivating factor is love for Juliet. Now, to think of a more commonly studied story in many junior high schools across America, in modern days, we look at a story like The Outsiders, whose main protagonist, the person telling the story, is Ponyboy Curtis, and his whole desire, or his want, is to have something or to get something. So what is he trying to have? What is he trying to get? Well, in a large sense in that story, he's trying to get acceptance. Not only from his own group, the Greasers, but, which he has to a degree, acceptance in that group, but not necessarily from his brother, he feels, throughout most of the story. So he's looking for acceptance, not only from the Greasers, but he's also looking for acceptance, or trying to get acceptance, from the outside opposing group known as the Socs. And he's also trying to get involved in a relationship with one of the Socs' girls, Cherry, in that story. So he's out to get something, he's out to have something. This whole idea of being an accepted part of society, not only for his own group, but also the outside group, the Socs. Now, in a story such as Of Mice and Men, by John Steinbeck, which is commonly studied in the 9th grade in my school, what are the main characters, George and Lenny, trying to get? Well, George is the one we really want to focus on because he's the main protagonist, and he's the one who's really driving the story. So what is George out to get? What does George want? What is George's desire? Well, you have to understand the story of Mice and Men takes place during the Great Depression, so millions of people out of work, very hard life, a lot of people hungry, a lot of people poor, on the move, moving from town to town, place to place, looking for work. And George and Lenny are in this situation. They're migrant laborers. So what are they trying to do? What is George trying to get? He's trying to get money. Like millions of other people during those days, he's trying to get money. But his dream is a little bit beyond just, everyday survival. His dream is more for long-term comfort, long-term success. He wants to have his own ranch. So his whole struggle throughout the story is to try to get this dream fulfilled. So these can be some stories where you can find these motivating factors, how the want and the desire go hand in hand for these main characters. Now, if you look over on the right-hand side of the board, what do I mean by the word influence? Well, again, the dictionary.com definition of the noun form of the word influence is the capacity or power of persons or things to be a compelling force on or produce effects on actions, behaviors, opinion of others. So, this is tied to motivation in a certain way. We'll talk a little bit about that in more detail. But let me give an example of what I think of as the word influence in this case. So you take a historical figure like the Indian activist Mahatma Gandhi, who led India's struggle for independence from Great Britain earlier in the 20th century. And one of his major principles, of course, during that struggle for independence from England was the principle of nonviolent resistance, nonviolent demonstration, nonviolent protest. So through his work in India and eventual success in gaining independence from Great Britain, certain civil rights activists here in America in the latter half of the 20th century, more particularly Martin Luther King Jr. and Cesar Chavez, they both had strong influence by Gandhi, by Gandhi's work in India. They both showed that their belief and their philosophies were influenced by Gandhi's, particularly in the form of nonviolent resistance. And Martin Luther King Jr., of course, is celebrated in America by his own national holiday in his honor for his work, his life, his career, for the nonviolent struggle for African American civil rights. And then Cesar Chavez was working towards attaining civil rights for Mexican Americans in this country. And he was a contemporary of Martin Luther King Jr., of course, early in his career before Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. But Cesar Chavez also promoted a policy of nonviolent resistance, nonviolent demonstration, nonviolent protest. So both of these very important activists in American history were very much influenced by Mahatma Gandhi's work in India. So you could say, yes, that Gandhi's work in India, and particularly his nonviolent approach, had an effect on the actions, the behavior, the opinion of Martin Luther King Jr., effects on the actions, behavior, opinion of Cesar Chavez, in their work to gain independent rights or civil rights for their people. Martin Luther King Jr., African Americans, Cesar Chavez, Mexican Americans. And they succeeded to a large degree. Now, if you look at a couple of literary examples, just quickly talk about Macbeth by Shakespeare, which is also commonly studied in high schools. So when we talk about, Macbeth, and his motivating factor, of course, is, again, desire. Desire for what? So one of the major desires could be also a desire for power. And this is one of the things that drives Macbeth, of course. So in his desire, in his drive to become king, he's influenced by his wife, Lady Macbeth. And Lady Macbeth is really the driving influence behind Macbeth's murder of the king, Duncan. And then later on, she is also instrumental in the deaths of others at Macbeth's hands. So in Macbeth, Lady Macbeth is really of major impact on the behavior of Macbeth himself. And then, of course, things end tragically for Macbeth and many others in that play. And another story where there's influencing factors on the protagonist is in the story The Monkey's Paw by W.W. Jacobs. So we touched upon The Monkey's Paw in a previous installment, where we talked about how this man, Mr. White, receives this monkey's paw with this magical power to grant the person 3 wishes. So I said in the previous installment that Mr. White, one of his motivating factors is a lust for greed and lust for power. And in a larger extent, this is true in the fact that having these 3 wishes, or having the ability to wish for anything you want, gives a person a tremendous amount of power. So really the sky's the limit in that case. And Mr. White's curiosity and this sort of intrigue feeling that he has about having this, powerful talisman that he can make wishes and whatever he wishes for will come to pass, is something that is very, very powerful driving factor for him. But again, he's a little bit of a cautious man. He doesn't know what to wish for. He's not even sure that the power of the monkey's paw is real. So he wants to try to think of something and experiment just to see if it will come true. But he doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know how to do it. And with these kinds of wish stories, you have to be very careful about how you word the wishes. Because if you word it in a certain way, it will come true, but in ways that you didn't expect. And in this case, in the story, White is told by the man who gives him the paw, Sergeant Major Morris, this thing is not good, this thing is evil, this thing is sinister, this thing is malevolent. So you got to be really careful. If you're going to wish for it, make sure that you wish for something that, you really think hard about. But Mr. White is not really able to do this. So he's more intrigued, he's more curious, and he's more, thinking about the magical aspect of it. But it's really his son at first who influences him into making the first wish. So his son Herbert tells him, if you just wish for this amount of money, then you'll be happy. So that's what really drives Mr. White to make the first wish, is his son influencing him. And then as a result of that first wish, because he didn't, think about the consequences carefully enough, something really bad happens as a result of that first wish. And then to get to the second wish, it's really his wife. His wife starts to pressure him. His wife starts to influence him harder and harder to make this second wish. And again, without giving away the ending, the wish that he wishes for, the second wish, is actually something worse than the first wish. And then it just goes to show that one character, one protagonist, can be influenced by people or other factors. And in the case of Macbeth, he's very strongly influenced by his wife. In The Monkey's Paw, the wife also has the influence on her husband, Mr. White, to make the second wish. But the first wish is influenced strongly by the son, Herbert. So, when we look at motivation and influence, there is some connection, there is some tie to these terms and how they appear in stories. So, one of the reasons why we're talking about this is because if we look at a test like the MCAS, where people have to write an essay about literature, the essay prompts for the 10 years that I've been teaching at this particular school, I've seen these MCAS prompts, they all revolve around character and identifying, analyzing character. So we're going to take a little break here, and I'm going to clear the board, and we're going to look at, in the next segment, an actual MCAS prompt from the English Language Arts test of 2018. Now, prior to 2019, the MCAS test was done with what they call a paper and pencil test. In 2019, this year's MCAS was, for high school, done on the computer. So it was a computer-based test. And in this year, the Department of Education, they started to experiment with different types of composition prompts. But there was some controversy that came up about the particular prompt that they used for this year's MCAS. Some objectionable content and some objectionable way of responding to that question. So the Department of Education, there was such a large outcry that they decided to rescind that particular question. So we're not going to worry about this year's MCAS because of all the controversial nature of that. But if we go back to 2018, the specific MCAS prompt for the long composition was something that revolved directly around characters' influences. So in the next segment, we're going to look at a specific short story, and we're going to look at that exact MCAS prompt and see how this short story could be used to answer that prompt. And we'll model that in the next segment. So that's all for now as an introduction. We'll get into the actual prompt in the next segment.